call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I move the motion relating to the blockade of Artsakh in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper. And I rise to express my support for the rights to self-determination of the Armenian people in Nagorno-Karabakh in the Republic of Artsakh. I condemn the unconscionable attack by Azerbaijan in September 2023, which has caused untold misery and has driven almost all Armenians who formerly lived in Nagorno-Karabakh from their homes. Azerbaijan's military actions in September 2023 were devastating for the residents of Nagorno-Karabakh, who had already endured a 10-month blockade of the Lakan corridor. Civilians living in Nagorno-Karabakh were forced to endure violence, as well as desperate shortages of food, power and medical supplies. The toll on Australians of Armenian heritage, including many in my electorate of Bradfield, and on those concerned for family members and other loved ones in Nagorno-Karabakh was enormous and remains ongoing to this day. The International Court of Justice found the disruption on the Lakan corridor has impeded the transfer of persons of Armenian national or ethnic origin hospitalised in Nagorno-Karabakh to medical facilities in Armenia for urgent medical care. The evidence also indicates that there have been hindrances to the importation into Nagorno-Karabakh of essential goods, causing shortages of food, medicine and other life-saving medical supplies." Close quotes. The US government publicly stated that the checkpoint on Lakan corridor undermined efforts to establish confidence in the peace process. The Coalition has consistently called for Azerbaijan to reopen the corridor, for the International Court of Justice orders to be honoured and for the disputes to be resolved peacefully and in ways that protect the civilians of Nagorno-Karabakh. Despite this, the Albanese Labor government, very disappointingly, failed to join with allies in publicly stating Australia's opposition to the blockade. Azerbaijan's attack of September 2023 drove more than 100,000 of the 120,000 Armenian inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh out of their homes and communities. At the time of the attack, the Coalition called for Azerbaijan to cease hostilities, as well as to protect the rights and culture of residents of Armenian heritage. We called for Azerbaijan to allow an independent international observer mission. The Coalition welcomed the Australian government's commitment of $500,000 for the United Nations Refugee Agency, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, to alleviate the suffering of Armenians who fled Nagorno-Karabakh. Coalition parliamentarians their officers spoke directly with representatives of the Australian Armenian community who were on the ground assisting refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh who were arriving in Armenia, seeking food, shelter and medical supplies. These Australians, members of the Armenian National Committee of Australia and other volunteers, reinforced to us the urgent need for humanitarian support for the civilians who had been displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh and the role the International Committee of the Red Cross played as one of the very few international aid agencies on the ground in Armenia. Based on that direct feedback, the Coalition called on the Albanese Labor government to make an urgent financial commitment from Australia to the International Committee of the Red Cross in Armenia to support the well-being of those fleeing from Nagorno-Karabakh. We also offered our bipartisan support for the Australian government to publicly state its support for the proposed international observer mission and to provide such expertise as Australia is able to offer based upon our nation's experience in supporting responses to international humanitarian emergencies. We welcome the fact that Australia joined the joint statement on the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh at the United Nations Human Rights Council in October last year. The Coalition supports the ongoing efforts by the international community to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the territorial disputes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Australia's major parties are bipartisan in our support for Armenia and Azerbaijan, reaching an agreement that guarantees the rights and security of the peoples of Nagorno-Karabakh and in recognising the sovereignty and territorial integrity of both Armenia and Azerbaijan. I therefore very much commend this motion to the House. I call upon the Australian government to take a clear and firm stance to call for the removal of Azerbaijani troops from the sovereign borders of Armenia, for the right of return for Armenians to Artsakh, and for the release of all Armenian prisoners, and for Azerbaijan to cease its erasure of the Armenian presence in the region.